Oh my God, you guys getting it fixed or what?
Oh, I'm staying with my grandpa. I stayed down here. We get closer to work.
All right. I believe that we left off with talking about balance of power. And balance of power is going to be our focus today, because the next question that is most important to realists is what balance of power system or arrangement is the most conducive to peace. And for realists, they talk about these balance of power arrangements in terms of polarity. Here we're not talking about electric polarity, but polarity does refer to the number of poles. Which also, let's be clear, we're not talking about Polish people or barber poles or any other kinds of poles except centers of power. That is what realists mean by a pole, is a center of power. Now they can think about it like a battery, right? Opposed poles. So those can be great powers, like the United Kingdom, like the German Reich, like the French Empire in World War I, or the French Republic is how they might like to have been thought of. We could also be talking about the superpowers. For example, the United States and Soviet Union during the Cold War. Poles can also refer in some cases to alliances. And sometimes there can be overlap between great powers, superpowers, and alliances. And that kind of will make sense. NATO and the Warsaw Pact would be an example of this, also in the Cold War, with NATO being the alliance that centered on the United States, and the Warsaw Pact being the alliance that centered on the Soviet Union. And that's, I think, why they use the language of poles, right? The poles attract allies to themselves because they're powerful, but yet the poles are also opposed to other poles, like on the positive and negative terminals of a 9-volt battery. Another possible example might be NATO right now, and possibly China and Russia. It's really kind of a fluid situation, so I definitely want you to have a question mark on that. Yes, Justin.
Any update on the China and Russia situation?
Not that I have seen. Thank you.
Russia's asking China for help.
Yeah, Russia right now seems to be kind of just playing wait and see. I expect we'll know more, but I'm not sure how much, just given that both countries are pretty opaque. And we'll find is there are three main types of systems based on polarity. The first is a multipolar system, or a situation of multipolarity.
No. You aren't even ready.
Right, as signified by this very, very old political cartoon about the Congress of Vienna that ended the Napoleonic Wars way back in 1815. In a multipolar system, there are several great powers. There is no superpower because there is no dominant power. It doesn't mean all the great powers are equal, but there is no power that is clearly far and away ahead of the others. And we're going to be thinking about these systems in terms of their pros and cons for peace. I'll also, as much as possible, use abbreviations for your sanity and for mine. Great powers will abbreviate as GP. Right? Great powers in this system can shift alliances amongst themselves to keep power, right? To keep power balanced. If one power starts to become stronger, one of its allies might defect and switch to another side to counter it. Okay. Another advantage is because of that ability to shift alliances, right, and the fact that there are just so many great powers, it is hard for one of them to really become too powerful and too dominant. And related to that, it's hard for one of them to become too aggressive because we can expect that there will be some other great power or alliance of great powers that would form to deter aggression. If one of the great powers started getting a little too antsy, a little too excited. For these, you may feel like you're getting an exhaustive version of this, or at least an exhausting version of this, but this is really a pretty quick and dirty version of these theories and the evidence in their favor. The debates about polarity have been going on for decades with no end in sight. So I'll introduce some key evidence for pros and cons, but don't take this as any kind of definitive collection. Right. One of the pieces of evidence in favor of the argument that multipolar systems are good, right, and by good we mean more conducive to peace, is the Concert of Europe that came out of the Congress of Vienna depicted in this cartoon. The powers of Europe got together and said, look, this whole Napoleon thing, running rampant and taking over continental Europe and invading Russia is bad. We should probably not let that happen again. So we're going to create this system, and it's going to be based on balance of power. We want to keep an active balance of power so that we don't have another Napoleon. And they kind of worked this out. Britain often played the role of balancer, right, which was nice for Britain. They're an island, not on the continent of Europe. If one power got too strong, they'd kind of shift to some other country on the continent and ally with them instead. And it worked. Right? From 1815 to 1914. It's almost a century of what counted for peace in Europe. I don't want to suggest to you that there were no wars, right, at all. There were, but there was very little in the way of major warfare and violence between the great powers. On the con side, great powers might make mistakes. They may not get the balance right to prevent one state from becoming too dominant or too aggressive. There can be a tendency for buck passing. Now, passing the buck means shifting the responsibility to somebody else. Right? That's why Harry Truman, the only president from our fine state, had a plaque on his desk that said the buck stops here. Right? Other people can pass responsibility, but ultimately the president's responsible. Same idea here. Right? Great powers might pass the buck to each other. Right? If a threat arises, they might just say, okay, well, we're just going to assume that another great power is going to deal with it. It's expensive to deal with it. We'll let somebody else do it. Which is how we might think of, we'll get to Hitler. Another reason that they might not get the balance right is that it can just be very complicated with so many great powers. Right? It's hard to figure out who's getting stronger, who's getting weaker, what the balance really is. And this can lead to the balance of power breaking down. And the key evidence here, one, is World War I. That same concert of Europe that lasted from 1815 to 1914 sounds great, but of course at the end of that century of peace, we got the First World War. And we often lose sight of the First World War because of the Second World War, but lots of historians are arguing and still contemplating just how much World War I started the gradual end of Western domination of the world. Right? By Western, we mean European, including also countries settled by Europeans, America, Canada, Australia. So World War I is a big kind of evidence against multipolarity. And then we do also get World War II. And people who criticize multipolarity as a not good system for peace would point out that in both cases, multipolarity led to a failure of other powers to deter Germany from becoming too strong and too aggressive. That picture of Hitler in front of the Eiffel Tower is a pretty perfect illustration of this. We think of the lead up to World War II. France was still doing a lot of things to deter Germany. Some of them weren't very bright. The Maginot Line, if you're a military historian, turned out to be a particularly bad idea. Britain, on the other hand, was not really spending much on its military to deter Germany. It passed the buck to France, and that didn't work. Our second type of polarity is bipolarity. And this is not a reference to mental illness or what is also known as manic depressive. But what it does mean is that there are two poles. Now, there are some other kind of examples, but we only have one really clear case of bipolarity, and that is the superpower rivalry in the Cold War. Which lasted a long time. Starting date differs for different people, but we're talking about a rivalry between those two countries that lasted from the 1940s to 1989. So what are the advantages of this for peace? Okay, well, one, the alliance structure is pretty simple. The alliances cluster around the two superpowers, as illustrated by this map. The U.S. and its allies in blue, and Russia and its allies, well, the Soviet Union and its allies in red. It's pretty clear cut. NATO versus Warsaw Pact, also both sides are pretty evenly matched in a bipolar world. Which makes it much easier to figure out what the balance is. And the idea here is that both sides being pretty evenly matched and knowing where they stand in relation to their competitor means that there is mutual deterrence from war. Right. And as a matter of fact, if you learn much about the Cold War in your U.S. history class that you may have already taken and completed, right, all of the talk about deterrence in your history classes probably came fully in the context of the Cold War, and that's it. And the key evidence in favor of the pro side on bipolarity is this, right? Despite massive sums of money being spent on weapons during the Cold War, and tens of thousands of nuclear warheads being produced, and lots of little wars and clashes, Cuban Missile Crisis, Berlin airlift crisis. Despite all of those things, NATO and the Warsaw Pact never directly and openly went to war with one another. You have to dig pretty deep to find examples of Americans and Soviets actually fighting each other. There are some cases in the Korean War. There were some Soviet pilots of MiGs flying against Americans, but they kept that kind of thing very secret because they did not want any sign that they were directly engaged in killing Americans, right, or fighting against Americans. On the other hand, with a bipolar system, there is less opportunity for shifting alliances to maintain a balance, right? If something gets out of whack, it's harder to just change sides to deal with it. There's also the very real possibility that intense rivalry, think about arms races, that kind of thing, could spiral out of control. As illustrated by this political cartoon. You've got an effort at peace, but in the background, right, if peace doesn't work out, what we get is mass destruction. And so that's the point, right? If a superpower war did break out, the results would be catastrophic. Right? Zane, would you mind not doing that, please? With your tapping of the foot? If you could put your foot down, please. Thank you. All right. Some of the scientific speculation during the Cold War was that if an all-out nuclear war happened, some of the stuff you may have heard about, nuclear winter, various things would happen and might kill us. But it was actually worse than that. Some of the talk was scientists wondering if we would get what was called a mantle breach, where part of the Earth would actually break away down to the level of the mantle and just like fly off into space. And at that point, we're just all dead. Forget about like what happens if the core of the Earth gets out. It's just like if something that bad has happened, we're all gone.
It's not how gravity works.
So, yeah, well, I don't know like exactly how this was going to work. Fortunately, we haven't had to find out yet. If we do, like it's going to be a don't look up kind of situation where the only people who are going to know about this to report to anybody else will be the people that left on the spaceship, right, in advance. Okay. And another thing, major wars still happen, right, and can still happen due to superpower rivalry. And from there, let's move to the evidence. One of these pieces of evidence is that there were some very close calls. And again, we only have one example of bipolarity, so even a close call in this situation, right, when all we have is a single case, is pretty scary. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 got pretty close to nuclear warfare. Right, the Soviets were putting nuclear warheads into Cuba, which is 90 miles away from Florida, and put them certainly in range of major cities in the eastern United States. For those of you who are thinking, well, Florida wouldn't be a big loss, and that's why I'm mentioning the other cities on the East Coast. And there were some very real and very major wars that still happened, even if they weren't directly being fought between the Soviets and the United States. Korean War, the war in Vietnam, which was we picked up where the French left off. You've got decades of conflict there. The U.S. is essentially involved for 2 decades, spends tremendous amounts of money, in a lot of ways wrecks the U.S. economy. 54,000 dead Americans. It's bad. Right? And then the Afghan War, which don't confuse that with America's invasion of Afghanistan. After the attacks of 9/11, this is the Soviet-Afghan War. Right? It lasts for a decade and kills tons of people. Right? Can't remember exactly what the death toll was, but huge, right? And in a country that was already very poor to begin with. Right? And helped bring down the Soviet Union, by the way. Okay. Our third type of system is unipolarity. There is a single superpower. To talk about the pros, we kind of need to bring in another theory. There are different names for this, but we're just going to call it them all hegemonic stability theory. It's kind of an offshoot of realism, kind of its own thing. And remember, a hegemon just means a dominant power. Yesterday, when we talked about realism, we talked about John Mearsheimer's argument that states want to be a regional hegemon, be the dominant state in their region. In this case, we're talking about a dominant state for the entire world. And this theory tells us, right, that you might have guessed from the word stability, in this case, stability also means peace, and that it's peaceful because it's good to be the hegemon. Right? If you are the dominant power in the world, then you want to maintain whatever system has got you where you are. So one thing that a hegemon does is it maintains its power, its military power, in order to make sure that no other state even tries to challenge it. For those of you that have taken a government class, let's use kind of a domestic politics example of what we're talking about here. Members of Congress are always raising money for their next campaign. And part of the reason they're doing this is because if they've got what's called a war chest full of cash, let's say that Deacon, not Sam Graves, is currently the 6th Congressional District member of Congress for the state of Missouri. And like Sam Graves, he's been in office for 20 years. And he just keeps raising money, right, and just piles it up. Well, if Chris decides to run against Deacon, one thing, this is tough, because Deacon, if you're going to be, or Sam Graves, you're going to be a Republican in a very Republican part of the state. Right? Chris already knows he's got an uphill battle. Right? But then Chris and people who would back Chris, right, look and they're like, oh man, not only is Deacon sitting here, a Republican in a bright red district, right, but he's also got tons of money. How in the world am I going to fight that? And you know what Chris is going to decide? Partly because people are going to be like, nah, I'm not really backing you, Chris. Right? Chris is just not going to roll. He's not even going to end up challenging Deacon. He might think about it, but he's not actually going to do it. Chris, you look disturbed by this. I know it's a really depressing kind of situation, but that's the same idea, right? Sam Graves is kind of like the hegemon of the 6th Congressional District. Right? The system is built around him. This is not a criticism, by the way. It's just if it were a Democratic district in a blue state, I would be having the same conversation. Right? We just changed the terms. Right? But this is the situation, right? Sam Graves is the hegemon of the 6th Congressional District. It's very hard for anybody to challenge him, partly because he has so much money. Right? All he has to do is open that war chest and show Chris the money, and Chris doesn't want to run, and nobody will back him. Right? So that's the same thing with the hegemon. Right? They maintain such a dominant level of power that no other state wants to even try to challenge them. Now, on the bright side, because this just doesn't sound very nice at all, hegemons have what is sometimes referred to as enlightened self-interest. Right? They help themselves by helping others. And so they make the system work so that it will help other states too. The idea is to keep other states happy. Right? If you keep them happy, and on the one hand you've scared them into not challenging you, but if they're happy, they don't have any reason to challenge you in the first place. Is everybody finished with this slide? Now, to talk about the evidence for the pro side in favor of unipolarity, we have to actually do some rethinking of history. And we're not rewriting history, but we're recasting it. In this recasting, we no longer think of Europe between 1815 and 1914 as a multipolar concert of states balancing one another to keep the peace. Right? What we instead have is, in fact, British hegemony over the world. Britain is the superpower. And another example is we rethink about the era after World War II. Right? We don't talk about it in terms of a bipolar Cold War. But people here who think about this in terms of hegemonic stability theory aren't arguing that the Cold War didn't happen or that the Soviet Union was powerful. But they're saying, look, if you really think about it, the United States is the dominant state in the world. Yes, the Soviets have a huge amount of territory. They've got a lot of people. They have the world's largest land army, but they don't have the wealth and sophistication of the U.S. economy. And so if we recast history in terms of hegemony of the Brits and then the U.S., right, we can go back to history. Some people, this will sound funny to some of you, the Dutch were hegemons for a while, back at the end of the 16th and early 17th centuries. But when the Brits were hegemons, their key tool of hegemony was the Royal Navy. That was it. There were European countries that had bigger armies, but nobody had the global reach of the Brits. And they used this to keep peace. They kept the oceans and countries open to trade, and this helped other countries get rich. And so they were willing to let the Brits be in charge. And as long as the Brits being in charge meant that they could get rich too. The U.S. went along with this in a lot of ways. Good morning, Tommy. Thank you. And the U.S., for its part, well, it did a couple of things. One, it formed NATO to keep the peace in Europe after World War II. Now, if you're the rebellious, questioning, argumentative sort like Emma, right, Emma? That's you? Okay. All right. I mean, obviously, as this goes into the recording, right, everybody's going to hear just how vociferous you were in your agreement with me. Right? Emma could say, well, I thought, didn't you just tell us that NATO was about countering the Warsaw Pact? Right? Well, sort of. Right? Hegemonic stability theorists would say, that's only part of the story. Right? And there's actually a really good saying, I can't remember who said it, but it's pithy and it works. Right? That the purpose of NATO was to keep the Russians out, the Germans down, and the United States in Europe. After World War II, everybody's still afraid that Germany, right, could do it again. Maybe third time would be a charm. So NATO was not just about countering the Warsaw Pact. It was about reassuring the rest of Western Europe that they could be safe from not only the Russians, but also from Germany. And on the economic side, the U.S. created a free trade system that did a tremendous amount of work to help other countries get rich. It's called the Bretton Woods system. You don't need to write that down, but it's your International Monetary Fund, your global agreement or general agreement on tariffs and trade. It becomes the World Trade Organization, and you have the World Bank that helps the world rebuild after World War II. And the U.S. can do this. One thing to understand, the U.S. doesn't necessarily need to do this. At the end of World War II, more than 50% of all of the world's industrial production was happening in the United States. Nobody was even close to us. Right? The rest of the developed world is wrecked. Europe, wrecked. Russia, wrecked. Japan and China, wrecked. So we created a system when we were already rich, and it helped other countries prosper, including, and probably even more than anybody else, it helped the countries the United States had just beaten in World War II become industrial powerhouses all over again and get richer than they'd ever been before. And they did this despite the fact that it ended up costing the U.S. economically. Especially it cost U.S. businesses because it created new competition for American companies. And here also, specifically in terms of Germany and Japan, their auto industries made huge advances at the expense of American car makers. And finally, in terms of the evidence, right, both the British and American periods of hegemony saw an absence of war, major wars between great powers or superpowers. Which is why the period after 1914 is sometimes called the Pax Americana, the American peace, kind of like there had been the Pax Romana during the Roman Empire. Right, is everybody finished with that slide? Okay. All right, now for the cons. One that critics of this point out is that, look, hegemons still start wars. It's not just that they get pulled into them, they sometimes start them. Also, this whole enlightened self-interest thing has limits. Right? Hegemons can go from being enlightenedly self-interested, right, doing good for others to also benefit themselves, to becoming simply more selfish. And they stop doing upkeep on the system that has made the world peaceful. And it seems that hegemons over time lose their position of power. Right? They get weaker. Maybe not necessarily they actually just get weaker in absolute terms, but they get weaker relative to other countries. That's why another name for some of these hegemonic stability theories are long cycle theories. And we get a long cycle of peace that is broken when the hegemon weakens and we get major war. Which would be another explanation for World War I, that Britain became weaker relative to other countries. And here we can get the evidence for the cons right in the same slide. First, let's look at those hegemonic wars. For the Brits, they fought a major war with Russia in Crimea in between 1853 and 1856. So, which was still a major war and is cited as one of the major exception to the concert of Europe. Although not the only one. The U.S. also essentially initiates the Vietnam War. This is not a blame America first. Please don't take it that way. And the U.S. initiated the war with Iraq by invading it in 2003. Yep. I realize now that that's before many of my students were born. And again, neither of these is to argue against those wars, but they are evidence that hegemons do start fights. in terms of that selfishness of hegemons, you can look at various periods since World War II where the U.S. has turned away from this free trade system that it built to help the world get rich and to keep other countries happy. One of the symbols here is when Japanese cars became not just a joke on American streets, right, or a novelty, but a serious threat to American car makers. United Auto Workers unions, various locals around the country, they would bring in a Japanese car and they would smash it to pieces. And sometimes as a way to raise money for the union. But beyond symbolic things like that, the U.S. turns to trade protectionism, which has happened very clearly within your lives. We could talk most visibly about the Trump administration, but the Obama administration did it too. Right? For example, tariffs on Chinese tires that they thought were too cheap and were undercutting American tire makers. And then, of course, we get the wars when the hegemon weakens. World War I would be the example of this again. Right? The Brits get weaker, and a devastating war breaks out. And then with a question mark, which I have pretty sure I left that when I did your notes, so that the question mark is there whether you put it there or not. Because I do want to make sure that it's there. I don't know that the Russian-Ukraine war is a war that is happening because the U.S. is no longer a hegemon. I mean, on the face of it, it seems like pretty good evidence that the U.S. is not able to deter other countries from becoming aggressive and upsetting the apple cart. But it's possible that that war simply means something else, right? Hegemons don't stop all wars all the time, but they do tend to stop major wars. And so far, the war is limited to those two countries. Okay, well, we finished a few minutes early. Right. Upload your notes to the assignment.